All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this conversation, which we are very excited about. I'm James Michalowski from the Hunt Institute, and before we get to our terrific guests today, I'm going to turn things over to the Hunt Institute's president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who is going to give some brief welcoming remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James. I'm very excited to kick off this new series today featuring leading higher education policymakers from different states around the country, as well as we have a national subject matter expert joining us. Many people in the higher education community are wondering how the next few months will play out, myself included, asking questions such as, will campuses reopen for the fall semester? And if so, in what capacity? Will coursework go forward online, in person, a hybrid approach? How will higher education institutions help workers displaced by the pandemic gain the skills they need to re-enter the economy? And a host of others, I'm sure we'll be grappling with through this conversation this afternoon. Our panelists have been working in close collaboration with institution leaders, legislators, governor's offices to think through these answers to these very difficult questions. And I sort of underscore very, very difficult questions. So I'm grateful and fortunate to have some time with these leaders joining us and kicking off this new series with us today. We have an all-star lineup. Looking forward to hearing from Kim Cook from the National College Attainment Network, Mike Krause from the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, and Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid from the Commission of Higher Education in Louisiana. Thanks to all three of you for making time to be with us. I'm looking forward to this discussion. With that, James, I'll kick it back to you to get the conversation going.
Sounds great. Thanks, Javed. So as Javed and I both mentioned, we're really excited to hear from our guests today. Before we do, a couple of very brief housekeeping notes from me. We have saved time for audience Q&A, and we look forward to your questions. Please do submit them using the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom app. I want to note that we will not be unmuting lines. So if you do have a question, please submit it using the Q&A. Or the other option, as you can see on your screen, is that you can also follow along with the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #INTWebinar, and please do feel free to submit questions via Twitter as well. Please do also include your name and organization as you submit questions so we can know who is asking it. So let's go ahead and jump into the conversation. We're going to start by having each of our three guests talk a little bit about their roles and also say a few words about how the pandemic has affected their work. We're going to start with Kim Cook, then go to Mike Krause, then Dr. Reid. So Kim, starting with you, could you give us a bit of an overview of your work at NCAN and how things have shifted for you all over the last couple of months?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity to be with you today and to share some thoughts. The mission of the National College Attainment Network, and those of you who have known us for a while will realize that's a shift from being the National College Access Network to focus more on the attainment goal that's shared by all of us nationally and within our states, is to close the equity gaps in post-secondary attainment. We do that through three major strategies: capacity building of our member programs, who are community-based organizations, many state agencies, and higher ed institutions, as well as school districts and K-12 systems, using policy and advocacy as a lever for change, and then new work thinking about systemic change, how we knit together the pipeline between K-12, this transition work to post-secondary, and working with our partners in post-secondary. Thinking about how this has changed our work, we put an initial survey out in the field to our member programs about a week after the stay-at-home orders hit nationally. We were somewhat surprised in that the replies to that survey were not necessarily programmatic. Certainly, FAFSA completion and emergency aid topped the list, but they came in below some very basic needs like digital access, like housing and food, healthcare and mental health care. So that really highlighted for us where this pandemic hit and the need to coordinate services, and certainly to think about where our niche and our subject matter expertise is on things like FAFSA and emergency aid, but also the totality of what was happening for our students and the many fronts that they were facing. Since then, I think some of those conversations have settled a bit, and I'll just set the stage to say they're shifting more towards affordability and fall enrollment questions. If, when, how, all about fall enrollment. So I'll stop there and leave time for more conversation later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I feel like we could spend the entire webinar on a number of the things you just mentioned, so we'll look forward to unpacking those in a bit. Mike, you are up next. I wonder if you can give us an overview of TX/TSAC and how you all have been shifting operations in the wake of this pandemic.
So we are a traditional higher education coordinating board. I know many of joining us for the webinar are probably pretty familiar, but just a quick review. We approve all new academic programs in the state. We approve all new capital projects for the state. And I would argue our most important roles were also the financial aid agency for the state. So everything from FAFSA to dispersing state aid like Tennessee Promise, those are the operational things that consume us every day. I think all of us will look back on that Wednesday in March, I think it was March 11th maybe, when I view life pre that Wednesday and post. And since that time, we've been wrestling with an array of issues, but the one we keep returning to is the sheer amount of forces pushing on higher education right now. So on one hand, we have the institutional challenges of having very significant fiscal issues to contend with. And then on the other hand, we have the value proposition that we've been offering to Tennesseans for the last several years with great success, which is to say, if you want a job that provides a living wage for a family, you're going to need to earn some college credential, whether it's a welding certificate or ultimately a terminal degree. And that's more complicated than it was 4 months ago, and certainly this time last year. And we're working through those challenges every day. I think one thing that we've adapted, and then I want to defer to Dr. Hunter Reed, one thing we've adapted that I think is positive, though, is when we outreach to students, the reality is many of our previous outreach mechanisms, we were pulling a 2020 student back to 1980 because we were all born in 1980 or before. And so whether we knew it or not, the way we were executing our outreach plans to students wasn't necessarily aligned with their native language, which is this phone. And so we have significantly adapted our outreach. Our FAFSA rate is actually just a little higher than last year. To be clear, we had a FAFSA deadline pre-coronavirus. But across the state, we have several pockets where we are not seeing the drop-off, I think, the loss of momentum around college attendance. And then the clear-eyed assessment is we have areas of the state we're very concerned about. But those are the issues that an agency like ours is thinking about. And I think they're similar, certainly, to what both Kim and Dr. Hunter Reed are working through.
Thanks very much, Mike. Very helpful. And a perfect tee up to Dr. Reed. I couldn't say it better myself, but I wonder if you can respond to Mike and also just talk a little bit about your role as commissioner.
Sure. Thank you. Delighted to join all of you. Ditto to what Mike said in terms of our agency. So the Board of Regents, Louisiana Board of Regents, we're focused on talent development, advocacy, and policy work for the state of Louisiana. First day of legislative session for us was the first reported COVID case in our state. And so it's just been a blur of activity of trying to keep education going. In 2 weeks, as you all did in your states, moving to remote education for our students, recognizing a significant digital divide and trying to figure out how to address devices and access to technology for students, ability to park and study, and all of that range of challenge. Keeping the healthcare, supporting the healthcare surge was important for us. So we were trying to make sure that we graduated students on time or early. We did about 5,000 of those students in healthcare. And then, of course, planning for the fall, trying to make sure that we're walking this distance with epidemiologists, that we're thinking about public confidence, talking with students, talking with parents, and trying to figure out how to have plans that allow us to be responsive, but to say to our students, don't defer your dream, keep going, don't stop. We need to make sure that we're continuing to educate you safely. But as Mike mentioned, the path to this success in this knowledge economy requires credentials and skills. And so we have a responsibility to double down on our commitment to talent development.
Great, thanks very much. It's very helpful and echoes a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the value proposition of what higher education looks like in this new reality, and also the fact that access to some of these programs is more important than ever, given the way that our economy is evolving. So now I'm going to kick things off and ask each of you an opening question. A reminder to our attendees, please do submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Kim Cook, we're going to go back to you for the first question, and I'd love if you could unpack a little bit more about what you mentioned in your opening remarks regarding that member survey and the way that the needs of some of your member organizations have shifted from maybe addressing some of the more immediate needs of students, such as food and housing insecurity, as they now perhaps pick their heads up and look a little bit towards the medium-term horizon. Can you talk about how you have tried to be supportive to your members throughout this process, and especially as their needs have shifted in the last month or so? Sorry, Kim, I think you're still on mute.
There we go. Sure, happy to do that. As you mentioned, we were somewhat surprised, somewhat not surprised by students and the programs that serve them, flagging that basic needs were topping the list of needs. In that way, many of our members are not, housing providers or don't run food pantries, but knew how to, are community leaders who knew how to connect students to resources in their communities. I think that ties importantly to the emergency aid, since emergency aid would be so critical in helping students meet those needs around food, housing, healthcare, mental health care. So what we have done at NCAN, first of all, is to make sure that we are getting out information and updates. It was quite a flurry, as I'm sure all of you experienced in the first weeks and through the CARES Act, of making sure that our constituents knew and understood the rapidly emerging policies, what they meant, how they were being rolled out. Implementation was key, particularly in the CARES Act, in understanding what emergency aid could cover, how it would be delivered, and helping our partners in the financial aid world understand how that they could distribute that aid. And many of those questions still persist as institutions still struggle to disperse the aid that they have. The other piece we've done is looking for bright spots, looking for best practices, looking for those who were able to pivot to things like virtual advising, how they were able to capture students in text messages, as Mike said, in the way that our students communicate today by phone. So really looking for some bright spots around virtual advising and FAFSA completion. Many states, Louisiana included, Nebraska, others have put out really fast, stood up campaigns quickly for FAFSA completion and reached out in different ways to try to maintain momentum. We're looking at FAFSA very, very closely because of its strong indicator of post-secondary for students. It's sort of the canary in the coal mine when we think about fall enrollment, to watch what's happening with FAFSA so that students have affordable options. They keep taking the steps they need to take to keep their options open, even if they are shifting. And I'm sure that's a conversation my co-panelists can address well too. Even if students are not going to where they imagined they would be going next fall or this coming fall, working a lot with students and supporting our members to work with students as they potentially transition to attending a community college this fall for affordability reasons, for being local, and working with them on how they'll maintain their credits and transfer them well to their terminal degree.
Thanks very much, Kim. Boy, you all are making my job as moderator very easy today, because Kim, you mentioned FAFSA campaigns putting together and being stood up very recently, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask Mike about, because when I've opened up my Twitter feed over the last couple of weeks, I've seen all my friends from Tennessee tweeting about the It's Go Time TN campaign. And so, Mike, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the campaign and the different partners that are involved, and why the messaging of this campaign is especially important right now in the wake of this pandemic.
Sure, and I'll start with the last part of the question, James, around why is this important right now. Depending on the research that you look at, we know that the enrollment in higher education immediately following high school is a significant determinant of ever going to college, and certainly ever graduating from college. Maintaining the momentum in the middle of a pandemic, in my mind, matters, because ultimately that we're not going to be just recovering from a pandemic. We're going to be economically recovering. And I think our concern is some of our most at-risk students maybe in the face of family hardships or maybe in the face of uncertainty because they don't know what their campus experience is going to look like, decide, I'm going to take a gap year. I'm somewhat uniquely qualified to speak on that because I took a gap 6 years in the military. And so I've been able to provide some tough counseling to students to say, you really need to go to college immediately following high school. We recognize, though, that that message doesn't just organically emerge within the community. And so I think one of the really cool parts of the Tennessee story has been it's always taken a village. These initiatives do not run out of THEC per se. We have incredible partners. We have a state advocacy group, SCORE, and some work that David Mansouri and Dr. Russ Wigington lead, where they are our post-secondary advocacy group in the state, pushing the conversation with industry, sometimes pushing us in government. And organically, I think SCORE recognized the need that we were going to quickly lose momentum without an intentional messaging campaign. So I'm grateful to them for pulling together a conversation that spans our flagship university at the University of Tennessee and our community and technical college system, and certainly our agency. And if you are, what we have aimed to do is equip school counselors with really good, high quality materials, and most importantly, a really good message of urgency. And being able to reach students wherever they may be with a very clear, yes, it's go time. Things are uncertain. We don't know exactly what the fall will look like. We absolutely know, though, you need to enroll in college. And so we are immersed in that message as we speak. We're very optimistic that it is taking root. But I think the single biggest thing that I've taken away from it is how important it is in these situations that there not be a single bearer of the message. The University of Tennessee has audiences they reach. The Tennessee Board of Regents have audiences they reach. And SCORE has audiences they reach. With all of those elements working together, I'm pretty optimistic. And I think ultimately, it'll be a story told in very human terms. The student that kind of wasn't sure, but man, it makes a difference if you just go ahead and take those 12 hours this fall. You may be online. You may be in a hybrid environment. But the fear that I have is the student that allows the uncertainty to push them into a workforce right now that is very unstable. And ultimately, as someone that did go to college as an adult, it is much harder to step across the threshold of post-secondary as an adult learner than as a traditional student.
Thanks, Mike. That makes a lot of sense. Dr. Reed, we had a question queued up for you about kind of the role of talent development in higher education. Would love for you to speak about that, but I also wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what you all have been doing in Louisiana regarding the FAFSA Now campaign in comparison to what Mike just mentioned is going on in Tennessee.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to cover both. I'll speak first about FAFSA Now because Louisiana is a state that has led the nation and run neck and neck with Tennessee on trying to make sure that we have more students than ever before filling out their FAFSA. After COVID hit, the Department of Education removed the requirement of filling out the FAFSA for graduation from high school, but we knew it would be more important than ever for students to have access to those resources. And so we did stand up a FAFSA Now campaign, our Office of Student Financial Aid. And so we've been pushing that message to the faith community, to counselors, to teachers, certainly to parents, through the media, everywhere we can to try to make sure that students are not stepping away from that opportunity, because we know that filling out the FAFSA gives you access to the financial aid, to work study. We also use it, in many places use it for scholarships, for the state scholarship, need-based aid, et cetera. So at the time we were at 64%, we're now at 72.5% of our high school students filling out the FAFSA. So we have continued work to do, but again, to Mike's point, urgency and momentum is very important. So we're still putting our foot on the accelerator when it comes to really talking about the importance of filling out the FAFSA and not deferring your dream. I would also speak to your point about the economy, the state of the economy right now. So we have hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced in a shuttered economy. And we're trying to make sure that individuals who have an opportunity to head right back into work safely do so. But that for those individuals who need to reskill or upskill, that there is a path for them to understand how to skill match into opportunities at our colleges and universities, our community colleges. We're focused on short-term, high-demand credentials. We're focused on returning adults who have some college, no degree, and everyone in between. We know that in this economy, this COVID impacted economy, that African Americans and women have been disproportionately impacted. So we have work to do to try to eliminate equity gaps and to accelerate equity of opportunity in our state. So there's so much that we need to do there. One thing that I think has helped is we've had an education workforce task force under the governor's Resilient Louisiana Commission, which brought together education providers, workforce investment boards, regional economic developers, early childhood advocates, and others to really talk about how do we think about system redesign that allows us to recognize the talent that needs to be developed in all, as Kim talked about, all of the resources and challenges that have to be addressed or met for people to have this opportunity. So there was as much conversation around early childhood and digital divide as there was around skill development and skill match, because it takes all of that to build a resilient Louisiana. So those are the conversations that are certainly happening here in our state.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And it certainly seems like bringing a wide variety of partners and stakeholders to the table for these conversations is emerging as a theme of the conversation. And I also want to kind of pick up on something else you mentioned, Dr. Reed, which is the importance of keeping equity gaps in mind and trying to ensure that responses to the pandemic and strategies to help students persevere through this hard time hopefully narrow equity gaps and at the very least do not exacerbate them. And I'd love if maybe each of you could say just a little bit more about the equity perspective as you're thinking of these responses. Kim Cook, we'll start and go back to you. I wonder if you're hearing anything in particular from your member organizations or other colleagues in the field about particular strategies to support students of color, low-income students. We have a question here about first-generation students as well. How are you thinking about supporting these different subpopulations in ways that hopefully narrow equity gaps?
That's entirely NCAN's mission, but what we have learned during the pandemic and what we are starting to see during the resulting economic downturn is no news to any of you on this webinar that those who are being impacted the most are the most vulnerable. They are those who have had a job loss. They are those who unfortunately are more likely to be exposed to and perhaps develop COVID, and they have the least resources. So we have been really doubling down on messaging that keeping on track and college is more important than ever now. Post-secondary attainment is more important than ever. We know from 2008, which is going to be, a comparison that's wholly inadequate, but the only one we have right now. The 2008 recession, more than 85% of post-recovery jobs required post-secondary attainment. So, we're really talking about the long game here when it comes to talking to students and families, that the long game and staying on track for post-secondary attainment is what's going to make some moves in equity. To do that, though, we have some serious affordability issues for starters. We have a lot of issues, but I just want to touch on affordability. Even pre-COVID and pre-economic downturn, only about 25% of our public four-year colleges in the country were affordable to a student who had a Pell Grant, state aid, a student loan, summer earnings, and an EFC. I mean, that's a student who did every paperwork right and checked all the boxes and got all of the aid for which they're eligible for. So that affordability issue is just exacerbated when you factor in job loss and uncertainty, which is why we're focusing a lot on the policy aspects here and what we can do, particularly to join forces in a campaign to double the Pell Grant.
Thank you very much. Very helpful and relevant. Mike, I wonder if you could say a few words about how kind of an equity perspective is informing some of your response in Tennessee.
Sure. One thing that we managed to do a few years ago is ensure that our state outreach strategy is tailored. No matter where you live in the state, we typically have a THEC outreach specialist, or what we call a program called Advise Tennessee, advisor embedded in your community. which is so important. And they live there, right? They don't live in Nashville. They live in that community. And so they're able to, I think, better gauge the rhythms and understand the right interaction points. What we're hearing out of that group, first off, our advisors love to be with students. And the reality is that's just not possible right now. So we're having to change our approach. We're having to ensure that we are finding ways to meet students using technology. And there's no doubt that has unearthed a great inequity in terms of technology access. And I look forward to any participant on today's call that has the solution to that, because I think we're all learning together right now about how we can ensure that a laptop and a Wi-Fi access spot aren't the barrier between you and success in college, because I think the truth is right now it is. I'd also say this is a really unique and equitable feature that is absolutely applicable to our very urban students and our very rural students. The reality is when we went online March 13th, and we're still analyzing the data, obviously, but I think our fear is there were students that the inability to have access to technology hindered their ability to succeed. So we've got to learn from that. And as we've been in an equity conversation as a state now for the last few years, I will admit that I never imagined that our equity conversation would now become tactical about who has laptops. The reality is it probably always should have been, right? But it took something like this to expose the rifts between who has access to a computer and internet and who does not. And that's something that I want to circle back. The fact that we have Advise Tennessee staff in the field, they're able to serve as the sentinels for us and able to say, I've got students that absolutely couldn't succeed right now at a community college. They don't have a laptop. Many of our community colleges and state universities bent over backwards to try to fill those gaps. But the reality is American higher education was wholly unprepared, I think, to have to make such a sudden shift. And that shift is one that we're going to be learning from, I think, for years. But we have to learn in real time because we may well have to execute the exact same plan this fall.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we've heard from some folks here in North Carolina about community college presidents being creative and moving their routers to the edge of the building so folks can pull up to the parking lot and access internet. But as you pointed out, the issues really are more systemic than that. And so it's certainly something to think about going forward. Dr. Reed, I want to give you an opportunity to say, either elaborate on the equity issues you touched on before or talk about some of the digital divide and device things that Mike just raised.
Sure. I would say that it's important for us to analyze who's doing well and who's not across the board. So we, in terms of the digital divide, we created a digital inclusion committee immediately after COVID hit for this very issue around access to technology and trying to understand that. Right now, we are looking to see who dropped courses, who failed courses. We're looking at it overall by institution, but also by race and ethnicity, so we can understand the impact of these conversations. Important that our campuses are doing outreach, as Mike mentioned, phone calls, the old school technology of phone calls, but also Twitter and nudges, et cetera, to try to encourage students to enroll. But we need to look at all of that information. Pre-COVID, we had set our attainment goals, 60% of our population in Louisiana having a credential by 2030. And we recognized we would never get there if we didn't erase our equity gaps or make sure that more of our adults had a credential of value. So we have even more responsibility now because, as all of my colleagues have mentioned, it's gotten harder for people whose lives are challenging. There's just so much uncertainty, but there's also just one layer on top of another layer of barriers to access if you don't have means. So I think these conversations are important. It's on us to do deep analysis and to bring solutions to bear to try to make sure we understand what's happening. We did survey all of our institutions to understand how many hotspots and laptops, et cetera, they would need. We've been trying to help to support the purchasing and the resourcing of all of that technology. But Mike is absolutely right. We have to say in higher education in America, the laptop and the access to the internet is just the way we go to school. And it should not be sort of an unusual way to do things. It needs to be par for course. And access to broadband in America needs to be like lights and water. It needs to be a resource that is available to everyone.
Thank you very much. Very, very relevant and very powerful comments. We're going to turn to some audience Q&A now. And as a reminder, please submit your questions using that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. One of our questions comes from Catherine Bailey, who I believe is from Austin P. And she notes that economic downturns often result in adults going back to higher education, as we touched on earlier. And Catherine raises this concept of the possibility that in one household or one family, an adult may be seeking to re-enter higher education at the same time that their child is involved in higher education. So kind of multi-generations dealing with some of these issues at once. So I wonder if you could each say briefly about how that dynamic might factor into some of your strategies as you think about how to support students and families at this time, especially regarding FAFSA. Are there any particular concerns when it comes to families with multiple generations kind of working through the same issues? Kim Cook, we'll start with you if you have anything you want to comment on.
My first comment is that these are some of the happiest occurrences in our work. We often have parents of high school students with whom we work predominantly who catch on to this and think a lot about the same messages we're sending to their students. So this is a really happy occurrence, and of course, good for strong economies and workforces. When you think about impact, this is another topic I would drop, is how many families are going to have changes in their financial circumstances. As many of you on this call know, when you file the FAFSA, you're using tax data from 2 years ago. So those who have had changes, whether it's job loss or this happy occurrence of retraining and going back to school, should carefully work with the institutions they'll attend to flag those changes and make sure that they're having conversations about how they could potentially impact their financial aid and open up more possibilities for more aid, since the income in the family would be probably decreasing in at least some way, and the costs of attendance for 2 or more in a family go up. So really a happy occurrence, and I would flag that there are supports for that, and to be sure to be in touch with your institutions about asking for those changes.
Thanks, Kim. That's a great point about sort of working with the institution and trying to get them to use their professional judgment to reconsider aid packages. I think that's an especially important issue for so many people across the country right now. Mike, I'll invite you to chime in next. I wonder, feel free to speak to the 2-generation question, or also this idea of how folks in Tennessee might be navigating the process of working with their institutions to reconsider some of their aid packages.
Sure. And we've had some really great stories come out of Tennessee Reconnect, multi-generational households all attending college. I think some of the things that we need to be mindful of, though, is that if you have a parent and a child attending college at the same time, my fear is they end up spending time around the dinner table talking about the higher education industrial complex, rather than, because look, the conversations around the dinner table that are transformational are when an adult learner gets their first A, right? And by the way, when a first-gen student gets their first A, and how cool is it if that adult learner and the child get their first A's on the same day? My concern, though, is when adults enroll in higher education, much of our system is built for 18-year-olds to this day. And so I think that we all have a chance to Kat's question, to think through our structures. So once an adult learner has crossed the Rubicon mentally and they want to enroll in higher education, our Reconnect data is pretty clear. Right now, at a Tennessee community college, our Reconnect students have a 72% retention rate. So that clearly speaks for the grit factor. I am very concerned, though, that we're losing students less to academics and more to the logistics, the industrial complex that I referenced. So what a great time for us to embrace this crisis and blow up some of the admissions checklists we have that feel, I think, often a lot like a campus scavenger hunt, rather than one place for a student to go. And those of us in public higher education have spent a lot of our careers criticizing the for-profit sector. And the reality is the for-profit sector has figured this out. When you walk in, you will deal with one person. They will be in many ways a bit of a concierge for you as you walk through the process. And so I hope that we will utilize the age of COVID to rethink our pipeline for students, to ensure, and by the way, this is for first-gen traditional students as well, we have just as much a chance of losing them as we do an adult student because of a name the form that they needed to get from the bursar's office. These students don't know what a bursar is, nor should we ask them to. And so I really hope that we'll take this opportunity to reframe some of our structures.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, always helpful to keep an eye towards silver linings and ways that we might be able to reimagine some structural aspects of the system. Dr. Reed, would love for you to chime in here on kind of the multi-generation concept and also the idea of reconsidering financial situations.
So I would certainly echo my colleagues' comments about the celebration of seeing two-generation success and two-generation grit in trying to move this forward. We are a state where our children are in poverty. We are either the largest or second to largest number of children in poverty. And we know that when families do well and parents do well, children do better and do well. And so we have a lot of reason why we think this is important, but as has been mentioned, it's hard to navigate this process. The financial aid and the resources are for traditional students. And so there are multiple barriers around bringing students back who are adults, around helping them to resource, around helping them to navigate and have courses and consistency around scheduling, office hours, all of those things. So we do need to make sure that if we are going to be excited about two-generation approach, that we have systems and structures that allow and encourage success when it comes to those opportunities. But I couldn't say enough about it. I can tell you personally, I've been part of some of these celebrations. We just had a fantastic story about a mom and daughter graduating medical school together. I've talked to students on college campuses who are going to school with their parents, and certainly in our women's prison, talked to incarcerated individuals who talked about talking to their student, their child on the phone, and they're both in school at the same time and sending this message that you can do it too, and we value education. So when we think about talent to be developed, we have to think about this broad swath of individuals who represent talent to be developed in our states. And we have to make sure that we have policies and practice that allow them to get there.
Thanks. Very helpful. Makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, we've got another question coming in here, and you all have touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you could speak further about it. It's about the role of community partners in a lot of these efforts, kind of not only in helping to get the word out and help with the messaging piece, but also, as Mike mentioned, folks who are embedded in these communities and can, do things like drive to a student's home when, they're stuck at home and drop off a FAFSA form or something like that. So I wonder if you could all say a little bit about the importance of community-based partners in some of these efforts, and we'll do the same order. So we'll start with you, Kim.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some cases, I would imagine that NCAN member programs fall into this community partner category as well. I think the strength and what makes community partners an important part of the mix is the trusted relationship, that this is someone I know, someone I've seen on a regular basis, someone I've interacted with maybe at school, at work, at church, at a place of worship. So I know this person, I know they're going to take care of me. I know they're going to be honest with me, and that there's a relationship. As we've talked about some of these solutions, which in some cases can help a student, like virtual advising or chatbots and technology, we always go back to one-off answers are good and help keep a student on track, but many times this is a continuing conversation and a place where you need to have support, or one question leads to a next step and a next step. So community partners, I think, have those trusted relationships and the ability to continue to be there for follow-up, to help see a student through the whole cycle.
Thanks, Kim. I think those are excellent points. Mike, is there anything else you wanted to add on the role of community-based folks in Tennessee?
Well, just to say we have an embarrassment of riches. Much to my chagrin, most students don't know who THEC is, and they shouldn't, right? But if you're a teacher in Tennessee, you know who SCORE is for certain. And if you are in any of our school counseling groups, you know who Tennessee Achieves and the Heirs Foundation are. And we're just very lucky. You know, the enemy of collaboration with community partners is turf. And we have just been blessed. We have a bunch of selfless leaders that don't do turf. The only turf we have is shared turf around students. And I'm just very grateful. I think we have some of our community partners on the call, but we're spoiled with really selfless leaders who were focused on the mission.
Thanks, Mike. We've done some work with SCORE in Tennessee, and we certainly agree that you have an embarrassment of riches in terms of engaged community leaders. Dr. Reed, anything you'd like to add? I know we were talking briefly before about the role of faith-based organizations and some of your efforts. Anything you'd like to expand on in terms of the role of community-based partners?
I do think that recognizing that, as Kim mentioned, there's trusted relationships in communities, and leaning into those organizations to send important messages is very important for our students. When we think about equity gaps, making sure they see people who look like them, who are encouraging and talking about the value of skills and competencies and education, and making sure that people are walking that journey with our students. You know, there's none of us can do it alone, and it takes more than a village. And so I do think that if we're going to be serious about erasing equity gaps, or serious about making sure opportunity truly exists for all, then we have to recognize organizations that have been in the field doing this work for a significant amount of time, and make them part of the solution and bring them into this work. So I would agree, and sort of ditto to what my colleagues have said.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question here that I'd like you all to weigh in on relatively briefly if possible. And it's specifically about concerns around learning loss. You know, because of school closures, both in the K-12 and higher education space, many students suddenly found themselves at home, you know, using digital learning platforms. And I think some subgroups of students may be particularly likely to be disproportionately affected by the way that the digital experience may not have given the same level of learning as the in-classroom experience may have done. So especially from a higher ed perspective, as you think about students entering higher education, perhaps with a deficit in terms of learning loss because of the school closures at the end of this school year, what are some ways that you and your partners are thinking about how to catch students back up and mitigate that learning loss? And Kim, we'll go back to you for the first response.
Sure. Obviously, this is a great concern to us since many of our students have inequities in the high schools from which they come from, in the curriculum that they're able to offer, and the teachers that they have access to. So many of our students are placed into developmental remedial classes. I'm concerned and watching carefully where those numbers land this fall, given potential learning loss or an inability to continue learning. So that's top of mind for me.
Thanks, Kim. Mike, anything from you on this question of learning loss?
Yeah, I think it needs to hopefully refocus how we view dual enrollment in early college. Unfortunately, dual enrollment in early college throughout most of the country has been available to elite students, when the reality is early college is for every student. It should be for every student. And as we think about the 19 weeks of instructional time we lost in Tennessee, something we're looking at really hard with our K-12 partners is how do you go ahead and say, you know, we lost 19 weeks, but we're going to swoop right through that and actually build new momentum because you're going to college for free. A student being told they can't take dual enrollment because their ACT score, in my mind, is troubling because I know of very few universities in our country that aren't going to take a student with a 19. The reality is many universities will tell a student no to dual enrollment, but 5 weeks later, if they were to graduate from high school, would admit them. Dual enrollment delivered while in K-12 is the perfect solution because it does have a wraparound support process. And the most important thing it does is it creates a sense of possibility for a student. So we are fortunate in Tennessee, every student can take 2 free dual enrollment courses. We have not succeeded, however, at making those dual enrollment courses readily available to all students. And that's about equity, certainly. And that's something that I really hope we will be focusing on this fall to say, let's make whatever instructional time you lost actually be a springboard that we're going to throw you in the dual enrollment, but you're not going to be thrown. You're going to have a ton of supports. You're going to have the wraparound environment of K-12, and seeing students who then understand, I just got transcripted credit in college for free, I think could have a huge effect on both a student's sense of success and certainly our state's workforce ultimately.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think some of these structured pathways into higher education have become even more important than ever in a time of disruption like this. Dr. Reed, would love if you could offer any thoughts you have on ways to mitigate learning loss.
Absolutely. I would say that, as Mike has mentioned, dual enrollment is very important. We too have a sort of statewide vision for universal access for dual enrollment. I have talked to our system presidents and campus presidents about early orientation for students who are coming in. Since you asked a question about freshmen, my concern is that because we're still in phase 2, and who knows if we'll be in phase 3, that we sort of exacerbate the challenge if you've had learning loss and you don't have digital access and we're not face-to-face. So I do think that we have work to do when we're thinking about how to have education, but also social distancing and healthy opportunities on our campuses. So there's work to do there. I would also mention in terms of continuing students, we surveyed our campuses and were delighted to see that 90% of our institutions that participated in the survey reported that there was no decrease in terms of students withdrawing from courses or dropping out of school. Why? Many of them stood up call centers and they called students to say, how are things going? What do you need? How can we help you? To Kim's point about this human engagement, someone checking in to say, I'm with you. I want to know how I can help you. So I think that there's information there that's important about the engagement, the navigation, the believing in students and rooting them on. But we have significant work to do. And I know that our K-12 partners are very concerned and focused as they again try to bring kids safely back, hopefully face-to-face if they can do that, to make sure that all of our students have an opportunity to mitigate learning loss, that they have the technology they need in case we have to toggle back and forth, and that we're recognizing and saying to them, you can do this, right? You can do this. We did this after Hurricane Katrina, right? We started in August. Katrina hit and we had major disruption. This is a prolonged situation, but the idea that the question as to whether we can address learning loss, I think we've answered that in Louisiana once already, but it will take significant lift and work and coordination to make it happen.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Reed. That makes a lot of sense. I really like how you talked about the intersectionality of need that's out there. You know, it's not just one thing. It's not just the digital divide. It's not just affordability. It's how these things intersect in people's lives. And it's important to keep all of that in mind as we think about solutions. We have about 10 minutes left. I would like to ask our 3 guests to each respond to one final question. And I thought we would end on a forward-looking note. So I'd love if each of you could talk a little bit about both the biggest long-term challenges that you think the higher education sector is facing over the coming years. And also, if you can do a hybrid answer, I wonder if you could also build in something that we touched on earlier, which is how are there opportunities that have arisen as a result of this pandemic to rethink some of the structural inequity that existed in our higher education system previously? How can we think about making changes to some of those inequities going forward? So 2-part answer, if you could keep it relatively brief, that would be wonderful. Kim, we will start with you.
I think the long-term challenge remains affordability and equity. And I say them together not because they're separate, but because they're intertwined. How we help our students have the resources they need to complete at the levels our states and countries need. Where am I hopeful? I'm hopeful in this never waste a crisis kind of way, that we're having some hard conversations. And, at the federal level, for example, dollars that we never imagined would flow in a $2 trillion package are flowing. So I'm hopeful that we have an opportunity to have a conversation that could have some resources that didn't exist last year.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Mike, forward-looking thoughts from you.
Yeah. This does provide a moment for us to rethink, I think, what is the fundamental mismatch of how our credentials are built versus what employers have asked us for. We offer two sizes of French fries in higher ed, large and supersize. You can get an associate degree or you can get a bachelor's degree, generally. Our technical colleges do a great job of sub-associate credentials. Our employers have been telling us for years they really need packages of skills. They are not necessarily as focused on the credential. And if anyone in higher education doubts that, we should look that Amazon spent $700 million to do our job for us. They're just going to build their own college. I really hope we take this as a dislodging event, to be more nimble, to understand that the bachelor's degree is not necessarily the empirical unit it has to be. What the empirical unit should be is what makes a difference in somebody's life and ability to earn a wage that supports a family. I hope we will use this is an epoch in American history that will absolutely go down along with the other major ones relative to the post-war period, 9/11 and the Great Recession. I hope we will use this period as significant of a tragedy and disruption as it's been to do equally disruptive things on our side. And the last point I'd make about that is about adult students. We learned a really important lesson this spring that this time last year, if an adult student, if their work schedule changed and they went to their professor, you know what the professor would have said, right? Well, you'll need to drop your class then. I think we just learned that they don't have to do that next year. And I hope that we are getting these lessons down on the cellular level within our institutions to be more student-centered. And I think we are. I'm going to end on the optimistic note. We have, at least in Tennessee, we have fantastic presidents who are driven by students. I think we're all learning together. And that's why, James, and the Hunt Institute, we appreciate these opportunities, because I think it provides the opportunity to learn from great people like Dr. Hunter Reed and Kim, and then for us to be able to take them back to our campuses and understand that there are no state borders when it comes to closing equity gaps and increasing student success.
Yep, I think that's exactly right, Mike. Dr. Reed, over to you. Mike ended things on a pretty positive note, so the bar is high for you now, but would love
Absolutely. So I will take that optimism of his and double down on that and say, you know, if you asked in Louisiana, in America, can we go online in 2 weeks for everyone, change at scale? Most people would say, no way, you can't do it. Now we've proven that you can move the battleship in 2 weeks and change at scale. So I think the challenge for us is to double down on that and build a structure that truly allows opportunity for all and is aligned to truly address the question of what does it mean to be educated in America, in Louisiana? And how do we ensure that we answer that question with the kinds of skills and agency and knowledge and adaptability that allows our students to really move forward, whether they're young or young at heart, for everyone, not for some. I think the opportunity for us is to really make sure that we are rethinking this change and making sure we're moving it forward. I would say we have answered the call when it comes to this crisis. In higher education, we have answered the call, whether it's life issues with our research, our testing, our tracing, whether it's livelihood in terms of skills, reskills, educational opportunities, short-term credentials, or beyond. We know how to be a strategic asset in terms of strong recovery.